Hello, everybody.
Hey, y'all.
So this is Roxan, and I'm Jamell, and we are part of the Post Ministry, and we wanted to put something together so that people in our ministry can hear from people in our ministry. So we came up with this idea called Real Talk, and what we're going to do is be talking about real life situations and these different topics, and hopefully it promotes some conversation amongst all of us, and it spurs us on in our faith. So hopefully this is pleasing to God, and we're hoping that this is encouraging you. So we're going to start off talking about vulnerability. This is going to be our first topic, and we want to dig into this. So Roxanne's going to kick us off.
All right. So, Jamell, what is vulnerability and what does it mean to you?
Okay. So vulnerability is giving those parts of yourself to other people that they don't see on the surface. Those things that you may necessarily not want to tell other people, not necessarily everybody, but the people close to you that you trust with that information, so that you can grow, so that you can get healing, so that people can hold you accountable. Yeah, that's what vulnerability is to me.
Okay. I think for me, vulnerability is just like, I want you to see me the way God sees me. Even though, it's like uncomfortable, even though like I can't hide anything anymore, I want you to see me in my genuine self. And I think there's like two parts to vulnerability. I think the first part is being vulnerable with yourself, being in touch with your emotions, and really knowing the different like barriers that you have up with yourself, and really assessing those things, and then like, okay, so now I know what's hurting me. And I think the second part with vulnerability is like sharing those other things with other people, so that they can come into like your hurt, and so they can come into your world, and so they know the things that affect you. So if you haven't seen Stranger Things 3 yet, I'm gonna tell you a little clip. Okay, so 11 goes into someone's mind, Billy, right? Billy isn't the nicest person around, but she goes into his mind and she sees that he was like traumatized. She sees that he was abused by his dad, verbally, emotionally, all these things, and he had a really close connection with his mom, and she was taken away because his dad and her couldn't get along anymore. So now he's like this hard person, he's really like rude and stuff like that, and she got a glimpse of how to talk to him now on this level of knowing the things that affect him. And so I think that's another side of vulnerability, really letting someone into all the things that affect you, and like where they come from, and like where they take you to in this place right now. I think vulnerability is considering how your burdens may affect the other person, so that you aren't putting too much on them. Because like, can they carry this right now? Like, are they in a place to help you carry these burdens? Just considering that. So that just makes me think that vulnerability isn't selfish either. So yeah.
So what does it mean for you? Where are you at with vulnerability?
Where I'm at with vulnerability. I just think that vulnerability is allowing yourself to just make room for other things. I think vulnerability is like emptying yourself, and really allowing more space to be filled with other things like God. I think when we take these other things out and we bring them to the light, it really allows them to not grow in the dark and to like fester and to like have us like bitter in any other way. And it makes me think about kind of like a plant, and like how you take like the soil out, so that you can make room for other things to be rooted in there and stuff like that. So I think vulnerability is like intentionally emptying out yourself in order for God to make room to like get deeper in these places that like God and this thing can't like coexist at the same time. You have to make the room for God to like come in, I think.
Message. That's my favorite song right now. Make Room.
Oh yes.
That's my jam.
Yes. Remember when we first heard that album and like he kept on singing that same part over and over again?
Oh
and we were
God.
like,
no, not that one. I'm talking about Community Music, Make Room.
Oh,
favorite
just
song
kidding.
right now.
Talking about Jonathan Reynolds.
Yeah,
Brother
you're talking about Jonathan Reynolds, and that's lit too. But this one's better.
Okay, gotcha.
But for me, it means vulnerability is very difficult because it's a lot of risk with it, and on the regular, I'm a fairly risky person. But when it comes to vulnerability, I'm risk averse because it can go either way. People can stop dealing with you based off what you're vulnerable about. It can completely change a relationship, and it puts you in a place where people know your weaknesses.
Yeah.
And so, what do people do with those weaknesses? And we've been scarred by friendships and interactions with people and even family, to where vulnerability becomes hard. So for me, it's something that's very difficult, but it is also a very healing thing because I believe that the devil is playing, Pac-Man with us, and he's just finding ways to just get us. And if I'm not vulnerable about my thoughts and what I'm feeling, my emotions and things going on in my life, the devil's going to play with it, and he's going to use that in many versatile ways to pull me away from God. So yeah. What is the definition of vulnerability?
So the definition that I found on Webster was just like the process of the state of being exposed to the possibility of being harmed either physically or emotionally. And I think that's true, but I think we come in with vulnerability thinking that we're going to be harmed in some way. And so we're kind of like holding back on how vulnerable we can be because we're anticipating like an attack at some point. And I don't think that's really healthy. So I think some things that I was thinking about of vulnerability, to me, I think vulnerability is intentional. I think vulnerability is trust. Vulnerability is strength, because being vulnerable, that takes a lot out of you, and it takes for you to be in a certain place with your security to feel like you can even like share that with other people.
Yeah. So along that line, what makes it hard for you with God and your relationships to be vulnerable?
Gotcha. I think in vulnerability in relationships and with God, well, in relationships first, you can't hide anymore. I think in vulnerability is like there's certain like barriers that you're putting down, so that when you're having certain conversations and you're being open with other people, it's kind of like, okay, like we're knowing like where you're coming from right now, so we're gonna like talk to you a certain way, and we're gonna encourage you in a certain way, because we're not gonna let you fall back into those things. And that's if you have like the friends that want to like uplift you also, and not just let you sit in kind of like your mediocrity and stuff like that. But that's something different. But I think when you have like friends like that that really want to help you, when you're vulnerable, they won't let you get back to that place. And sometimes that's not comfortable. That's never comfortable for them to call you higher in that way. And I think vulnerability is hard for me when it comes to God, because I see God as my dad, and I look at the relationship with me and my dad like on earth, and I'm like, I don't want to disappoint my dad. I don't want him to think that I can't do this, or that that all these other things. And it's like, so when I disappoint God, it's like, man, like I don't want you to see me like struggling like this. I want to make you happy. I want to like make you proud and stuff like that. So I'm coming to you like when I'm at the bottom, it just really hurts.
I think that's definitely one of the things. I like the points you said about those people aren't going to let you stay the same, and that's part of what makes it hard for me to be vulnerable in relationships and with God, because I feel like when I write a piece, when I write a spoken word piece, I feel like whatever I'm writing about, because those come from a very vulnerable place, whatever I'm talking about, I'm going to live it out after I write that piece. And I'm going to live it out in full and have to wrestle through that for real. And I feel like that just is a part of my relationship with God. With the things that I'm being vulnerable about, God's not going to let me just go back into my shell. It's like, okay, you're in the light now. You're not about to go back in the dark with this and allow the devil to use it. Now I'm allowing God to use this to refine me. So that's the hard part about with God, because you come to God with stuff, and it's either fight or flight type thing with God. Like, you're going to have to fight for your relationship with God. You're going to have to fight for that growth and fight to be used by God, and God's going to push you. In relationships, though, like I said, it's a very risky thing. It's a very risky thing because it can go south real quick. People who end up knowing you on a totally different level, that puts you in a very vulnerable place. It puts you in a very vulnerable place and makes you in a weak place to where like they can really hurt you. And that's the scary part about being vulnerable, because you let somebody close enough to where they can hurt you more than anybody else. Some random person on the street, like, they won't have that much of an effect on me. It's the people closest to me that can tear me apart. And so that's the part about being vulnerable that's really difficult. Yeah.
And I think before we get into this next part, so like when you're studying the Bible with people and you're looking at vulnerability, how vulnerable, do you get with people that you're studying with? Because it's like, you're expecting a certain amount of like vulnerability like from their end, but like now, like, how do you respond, or like how do you lead with vulnerability in that way?
So one thing I think is very important is to find those people you look up to spiritually and follow their example. So when I was studying the Bible, Jazz and Terrence, were those are the people that baptized me, and they were very, and they were very open about their lives, what they struggle with, insecurities, and all that stuff. And so for me, moving forward, that was the standard, and it made sense. And I took that with me everywhere I went with building any relationship. That vulnerability is going to be the foundation, so that we can really know each other. So even when I'm leading my Bible talk, that's what we kickstarted off. Like, our Bible talks are lit because everybody's talking, everybody's engaged, even the people that do come out and visit, because it's not just like the same one or two people talking all the time. It's everybody being open about their life, and it makes the visitors feel like, oh man, like, oh, they for real, like they really, going here. And it makes them feel like, oh well, if they putting all this stuff out there, I can give a little bit.
Yeah.
And so when I study the Bible with people, I'm vulnerable fully, just because I don't want to paint this picture that I'm a disciple. Now all of a sudden I'm a perfect man, and so that's the other thing that I don't want to communicate. But it's also very beneficial too, because being vulnerable in those studies can reveal certain things that you wouldn't have expected. I was studying the Bible with this guy Monday, and I was vulnerable about the fact that, like, we were talking about how God calls you to do certain things that you may not necessarily want to do. And the thing for me is I didn't want to lead a Bible talk at all. And, I was put in that position and I did it. Now, when I told him that, he was like, that's crazy, because my frat brother invited me out to this Bible talk, but I kept coming, and I brought my girlfriend because of the way you led it. I really enjoyed the way you led it in the atmosphere of the group. And so when you think about that, it's like, if it wasn't for that vulnerability, I wouldn't even known that. And that's something encouraging for me to spur me on with continuing to be vulnerable, continue to give, continue to lead the Bible talk the way I lead, and encourage others to lead the same way, because this is what people feel from it. So yeah.
And that reminds me of that scripture, just like, we're not only like sharing the gospel with you, but we're also sharing our lives with you. And I can't quote it exactly, but it's in there, trust me. But yeah, it just reminds me of that scripture. So that was good. That was really good. Yeah.
So what is the difference between being open and being vulnerable?
Yes. So I think being open and being vulnerable, I think even like saying it out loud, they kind of like elicit two different responses. I think being open, we can be open about, like, how our bosses are making us struggle. We can be open about like the roommate problems that we're having and stuff like that. We can be open about like a plethora of things, because they're not really like going any deeper than like what's happening like on a day-to-day kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think vulnerability is kind of like, peeling back those layers and saying, okay, so like this is how I'm feeling. This is like how like this is tapping into like a past hurt that I haven't really addressed. This is like, like what I'm going through right now, even though, even saying, things are going great right now, but I'm still not happy. I don't know why I'm not happy right now. I think even being vulnerable enough to like share those thoughts that are even scary to yourself, so that it can be out, and so that it can be in the air, and so that it can be in the light, so that it doesn't continue to be in the darkness. So I think that's the difference between being open and being vulnerable. But at the same time, I think that being open is the first step into being vulnerable, because I think once you like establish that kind of like, relationship, that rapport and stuff like that, okay, I was open with you a good enough amount of times, and now I feel comfortable being vulnerable with you, and I trust you, and I trust your judgment. So I think that's the difference. But what do you think venting comes in?
So venting is kind of like on the end of, I'm being open, but I'm also not even expecting any real feedback. I'm saying this kind of just to complain. Just to, put it out there and, sometimes talk trash about a situation, or just talk. You're venting your frustrations. That's kind of negative side of venting, but also, just getting it out. Sometimes you have to, just get it out about a situation, just so, it's not, you're just not holding on to that anger anymore. But venting can lean on the end of, okay, I'm venting, and I don't necessarily like care to hear any feedback. I just want somebody to listen. And I also think it's a side note. I feel like it's very important when you are listening to somebody talk about whatever their experiences is, or whatever they're coming to you about. I think it's very important to ask them, is this something you want to talk about, you want dialogue about, or do you just want me to listen? Because I'm fine with that. I think it's very important to distinguish the two, because I think sometimes we impose what we think on people when they're being open with us.
Yeah.
And that, you know, that can create some frustration.
Yeah.
To an extent where, you know, it's a very common thing where we just want to fix people.
Yeah.
So when they come to us with our stuff, we automatically jump into fix it mode.
Yeah.
And I've struggled with that myself and have come to a realization about that. But sometimes we don't necessarily want to be fixed. We want to get this off of our chest. And then, you know, maybe later we can talk about, you know, alternative perspectives about this and views and ways to handle this. But venting can lean on the end of more so we're just talking. And like, I'm not really looking for any feedback. I'm not really looking for you to point me to God. And that's the dangerous end. When you're talking about something and you don't even allow the room for somebody to point you back to God, you just want them to soak up all of your frustration. That's very dangerous.
Yeah, and that immediately reminds me of Job. And when he was going through like all those different things and just really struggling on a level that I don't think any of us can really relate to, and really just sharing that with his friends. And then for them to immediately like just like come back with him with like, well, you know, like something must have been wrong. Like God doesn't just punish anybody. Like you must have been doing something. And it just makes me think about like when we are vulnerable with people, and like when we're in that position when we're listening to someone being vulnerable with us. You know, are we listening to answer, or are we listening to understand like what they're going through? Because I think that's also important. Because I think Job wanted them to listen to understand, listen to like empathize with what he was going through, because it was like, you know, guys, like I lost everything. Like, can y'all like empathize with what I'm going through? And him even saying like, you know, why do you guys hurt me? Like, why are you guys hurting me right now? Like, I'm just telling you like how I'm feeling. So it makes me think about that also, just with vulnerability.
Yeah, I like that example.
Yeah. So who should you be vulnerable with?
I feel like you should be vulnerable with people who are going to point you back to God. So that's, you know, that's a tricky thing, because we do have, you know, sometimes we can have spiritual friends, but we also have those friends that are about it. And that can be dangerous too. So whatever energy you come in at the situation with, they matching that energy. You come mad, they mad too. Like, who we pulling up on type thing. And that can be, you know, that's dangerous as well. Like, you want to be vulnerable with somebody level-headed enough to not necessarily just go with whatever emotion you're feeling. Not saying they can't empathize with you, but they can still, like, you know, call you hard. They can still be from an unbiased point of the situation. And that's very important. Like, sometimes we're vulnerable about stuff and you need somebody to look at the situation from an unbiased standpoint. So that's why I think it's really important of who you're vulnerable with. But also you want to make sure you're vulnerable with, depending on what it is, that it's not going to affect that person in a negative way. I feel like I've come to learn that in relationships, you have to have emotional boundaries. There has to be emotional boundaries. So with that, if it's going to cause somebody to struggle or lead to a rift in their discipleship in the long run from you being vulnerable about this specific topic, and I'm not saying like, you know, go on trying to predict whether or not this is going to make this person struggle or not, but there's some stuff that's very obvious. There's some stuff that's very obvious that this is going to make this person struggle. But it is a thin line, but you want to be careful about that. You know, there's just certain, me being a man, there's certain stuff I'm not going to be vulnerable with Roxanne about, partially because she's a woman. And so you have to be careful about that. There's always opportunity for somebody to look at you differently. There's always an opportunity for somebody to treat you differently. But sometimes that can come from somebody just trying to protect themselves. And you have to be aware of that. You don't want to put somebody in a compromising situation because of what you're being vulnerable about. So yeah, that's what I have on just being vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that just comes with discernment and wisdom. Just thinking about, you know, like if I share this with this person, like just praying that, like, you know, like praying about like who should I share this with, and like, you know, like how can they be effective and stuff like that. So you're not just like assuming like they can handle it, or assuming that, you know, this will be okay for them, but really even praying before that, and, you know, getting like the okay from God. Because like I was saying earlier, like I think vulnerability isn't selfish. So always like considering the other person in everything you're doing, like Philippians 2. So yeah.
So along the lines of being vulnerable with somebody that's going to be unbiased to the situation, it made me think about Jonah. So For those that don't know, Jonah's a short book. It's 4 chapters, but it's about this man that God had called to preach a message to a group of people. Now, he didn't want to. He ran away from it for a while, but when he finally did, God ended up forgiving them for what that, for their transgressions. The message was, along the lines of talking about their evil ways. Those people were cut to the heart. God ended up forgiving them. And Jonah had an issue with it. Jonah had a whole issue with God's approach. He was like, look, I knew you were going to forgive these people, which is why I was running in the first place. And he didn't agree with God. And he was open about what he was feeling. He was very vulnerable about that. And he was frustrated. And he said, you know what, it's better for me to die. And and God asked him, is it right for you to be angry? And so, that's an important part. If you ever had that friend that you're frustrated about somebody, and it's like, do you have the right to be angry? And I remember when I remember early on in my discipleship, this is the first few months, I was frustrated, about a situation, about this girl that I was dating. Well, not dating, but we were on and off. And Jazz was approaching me about this situation. And he's like, hey man, I know you mad, because I'm walking away mad at this point. I'm hot. And he's following me. He's like, hey bro, are you all right? I said, I'm good. I'm going home. And he's like, you sure? I'm good. And then he's like, I'm about to tell you something. I know you ain't gonna like it. I said, don't say it then. And he's like, no woman is yours until you put a ring on it. And I was hot, because nobody wants to hear that when you're frustrated about somebody, that you care about or want to be with or whatever that is. But he gave me a alternative perspective about that situation that really was like, I can't be mad. And I feel like God did the same thing for Jonah. Is it right for you to be angry? So back to that story, Jonah goes and sits under this tree, and and he feels good about sitting under this shaded tree. God let the sun scorch this tree and ended up getting the top of his head hot to the point where he felt faint. And then Jonah was mad again and said, I'd much rather die. And then God used that tree as an example. You're frustrated about the tree, but did you tend to it? Did you even plant this tree to even get it to the point where it's growing? So why are you angry about it? And that gave Jonah that should have gave Jonah a completely different perspective about the people he was mad that God forgave. Right? It's like, I'm the one that put these people in this position. You didn't do anything for these people. All I need you to do was deliver a message, and you're frustrated about me forgiving them. So yeah, that's just an example about when you're vulnerable with somebody and they give you that alternative perspective that you weren't even thinking about, and also being vulnerable with somebody that's unbiased to your situation. So yeah. So the next question, what can happen if you are not vulnerable?
So I think it just becomes I think when you're not vulnerable, I think you can isolate yourself in a really deep and heavy way, because no one can read our minds, no one can know what we're going through and stuff like that. And so I think when you're not vulnerable, you put yourself on this island by yourself, and no one else can reach you there. You can be coming to the meetings of the body every week, you can be going on all these things, but it's when you're not vulnerable, you're not letting people know what's hurting you. I mean, what are you really doing for yourself? You're doing yourself a disservice, just playing church, or just playing whatever. But it's when you're not vulnerable, you're leaving yourself room to make those things bigger than what they are. I was listening to this message that Alexa sent me actually, just about the things that we focus on, and it was by Stephen Furtick, and he was just saying whatever you focus on becomes bigger. So I think when you're focusing on these negative things and focusing on what you don't have, those things become bigger, and because you're not letting them out or letting anyone in, that's all that you can see. And it just reminds me of just an illustration of a balloon, right? Okay, so if the balloon is too big and has all this air in it, it's gonna pop eventually. But if it has a little air out at a time, it'll be a good amount of air in there. So it just makes me think about how when we're vulnerable, we're letting a little air out so that we don't explode or implode and stuff like that. Because I think when we keep all those things in, it's we're inevitably gonna explode in some kind of way. Either we're gonna lash out, or either we're just gonna implode within ourselves and it's like collapse because there's too much stuff going on. So I just thinking about like that balloon and how it just needs to let a little air out, because when it has too much, like if it bounces on something or if something happens to it, it's gonna pop because there's too much going on the inside.
It's so much about this question. It's so many things that can happen. One, like we said before, the devil can play with what you don't give to God. If you don't give it to God, that means it's staying with you, and the devil's gonna play with it. And I think it's important to give the things that are hurting you. And I'm not talking about just your sin. I do believe in the James 5:16 that confess your sins to one another so that you can pray for one another. But also, like, not even just the sins, just the emotions, the thoughts, those things that you are going through, the things that are happening around you that are making you feel some type of way. When I first became a disciple, I remember just hearing brothers talk about things, just talk about things like, I'm being vulnerable about this. I'm like, that seems so small, but it's really those small things that can lead to something big. And we're just shocked that something big happened, but we're not even thinking about like these little things that happened along the way, these little triggers that happened along the way that we didn't, that were warnings, to what we were to struggle with in the future. So even that, like, that vulnerability, like, if you're not open about that stuff, you can end up in a situation that you couldn't have imagined yourself being in, and it feels like it just happened all of a sudden. But see, it's a slow process. Things like that are a very slow process, and it eats away at you slowly when you're not giving it to God. And so some people lash out sometimes, like you were talking about, and it's kind of like what Roxan was saying, filling this balloon up. Like, those little things are just filling this balloon up until it pops, and you're just like, oh, it was just that one thing. It wasn't just that one thing that made you pop. It was all the other stuff before that. But I also believe Mark 7:20 talks about what comes out of a person is what defiles him. And I feel like if you're keeping that stuff, if you're keeping whatever it is inside of you, it's going to come out one way or another, whether you're vulnerable with it or whether you're keeping it and just, saying like, I'm gonna just keep this in my pocket, this ain't no big deal. It's coming out one way or another. And I think I think about, do I want it to come out in a way that is going to defile me? Those things that you have built up, they end up having a lasting effect. And the things that happen to you, those experiences, even that, I'm an advocate for counseling, just because there are things that people around you just aren't trained to deal with, they don't have the level of understanding or training just to even talk you through this. And a perfect example I think about, a perfect example of just needing to be open about just the things that have affected you throughout your life. At my camp, we used to do this activity, right? And we would tell kids this story, and it's about this little boy named Jimmy, and he's he in school, and he wakes up that morning, tries to say what's up to his parents, and they yell at him, tell him hurry up and get on the bus, right? He goes to school, everything's fine. Teacher talks about a field trip coming up. You need the money for it. He goes back home and he asks his parents for money for the field trip, and they say, oh no, we don't have no money for that, blah blah blah, and they're yelling at him. Then he goes to the teacher. He figures out a way to pay for this trip on his own dime, and she's like, well, you can clean some of the bathrooms at the school and we can pay you for it, right? And so he does that, and one boy saw him, goes back and gets another group of boys, and they bust in the bathroom and they're teasing him, just calling him names, ha ha ha, Johnny's cleaning the bathroom, and blah blah blah. And it ends up, getting him to a place where he just doesn't value himself. We use that example to talk about self-esteem and how things in our life can affect our self-esteem and really tear us apart. And then it comes to a point where the people around you, the people you rely on, come back along and they help piece you back together and make you whole again. And that's what I think about vulnerability. When you are vulnerable, you're allowing yourself to be made whole again. You're allowing yourself to get that healing that you very much so need. So that's like a big part of it. Like, if you're keeping this stuff in, like, there's stuff that, people are like, I don't want to talk about that. And for what it's worth, it's not, some stuff in your life is not worth talking about to everybody. That's why we talked about who you should be vulnerable with. But keeping it just to yourself, it's not going to cut it. If you don't feel comfortable talking to people in your life, counseling is one thing, and that could get you to the point where you feel comfortable talking to the people around you, letting them in, and then harvesting a way better relationship with them than you had before. But it's so important to latch on to that aspect of it, because when you are vulnerable, it can make you whole again, just through that healing and allowing God to maneuver through that. You being vulnerable is saying, God, I don't want this anymore. I'm putting it out there. Do what you need to do with it to make me new. So yeah, that's what I had on that.
Yeah. And I think that vulnerability, like I was kind of alluding to earlier, I think it's like a process of like emptying and filling, like emptying out the things that are like affecting us and things that are like hurting us, so that, you know, not only can like God feel it, but also our friends and our family can also feel those things. And I remember when we were talking about vulnerability and like our family, and like how vulnerability with our family is like it hits different. It's a different kind of vulnerability, and I think that even takes another layer of like being vulnerable with ourselves and really like addressing those things that they've, you know, either done to hurt us or they continually do and stuff like that. Yeah, and it makes me think about that. But the last question that, you know,
I had something to add to that. Even thinking about that, like, your vulnerability can open doors to so much. One thing I've always fought to do over these past year and a half, 2 years, is be vulnerable with my father about my walk with God, which is something that's very tough, because we go back and forth about it a lot, just because some stuff he doesn't necessarily believe. So we kind of, you know, butt heads about it a lot, just because he doesn't, you know, it's like, why are you doing all that? It don't take all that to follow God. And I'm like, it does. Just like with any relationship, there's a level of effort you have to put to make it work. But when I was in the hospital after my surgery, the nurses were doing me any old kind of way one particular day, and I couldn't eat all day, so they didn't let me know that whatever procedure I was waiting to get to eat, they didn't let me know till 9 o'clock. They're not coming to do this procedure. So the kitchen had already closed. We couldn't eat. Side note, my dad, while I was in the hospital, he had to go to ER because his leg was messed up really bad. So when he found out, you know, that I could finally eat, he was going to walk across the street to grab me some food. But my friends Tina and Richard were there, and they were like, nah, you know, your leg's messed up. Like, let us go get it. We'll be right back. And, you know, something small, right? It's just, that seems like just a regular act of kindness. But the next day, my father, he was like, you know, I know me and you butt heads a lot about church, but I see what you're talking about. I see that love that you get from that. I see the love that just even exchanged, like them doing that for me meant a lot to me. And I know we've disagreed about this a lot, but I'm really starting to gain a better understanding of what it is that you are really fighting for, just through that act of kindness, and just all the people coming up to this hospital to support you. Like, it's really become a family, all through your relationship with God. And like all of that, he saw people just bringing stuff out. He saw people coming just to sit with me, even when I was unconscious and drugged up. Like, he saw that, and that molded his mind on what a relationship with God could look like. But I also think if you are not vulnerable, you can block how God wants to use you. And I think about Moses when I think about that. And, you know, God called Moses to do something, and Moses was stuck on the fact that he don't feel like he can lead these people because he can't talk right. He was stuck on the fact that I don't feel like I can lead these people because I can't talk right. And God's like, you know what? I feel it. Here, take Aaron with you.
Yeah.
And so, like, if we're not vulnerable, we don't even give God the opportunity to qualify us. And I feel like he qualified Moses in that moment. It's like, you don't feel like you're good enough, but this is going to happen one way or another. Let me give you the tool to help you along your journey. And to the point where Moses was speaking to the people himself down the road. Like, he gave them a crutch so that he could make it to the point where he could be leading these people down the road. So, like, even that, like, your vulnerability, your fears about something, your insecurities about something, when you're vulnerable about that, that can change what God really has for you or is wanting you to do. Because sometimes it's our insecurities that's holding us up and making us not want to do the things that we kind of get a tug to do. It's something pulling on our heart or something like that. And we're like, nah, I'm not doing that. And when you're vulnerable about that, you have somebody, you will give God and somebody else the opportunity to encourage you in that way or give you what you need in that way to do what you need to do. It was the same thing when I was leading the Bible talk. I didn't want to do it. I didn't feel like I was at a right relationship with I didn't feel like I had the relationship with God I needed to. And I'm thinking I gotta be like Jazz or Angel or something. I'm like, no. And they qualified me. The first Bible talk I led was with my best friend Terrence. So, it was when you're vulnerable, you allow God the opportunity to intercede. So yeah.
That's really good. And before we move to the next way, this reminds me of just like how just these past few weeks have been like the most I've been crying like in a long time. And I think that's because I've been like really like vulnerable with like my friends and with God. And what's like interesting, because like before, when I wasn't being like as frequently as vulnerable as I am now, is like, like I felt like, I had things in control and like things were fine. But when I finally like let those things go and really just like let God like know like my heart, like I feel like more of myself, and I feel closer to God, and I feel closer to my friends, and I feel like more whole. And I think that's the thing I was trying to like explain, just like how like this emptying and filling things like a natural like reaction. It's not just us emptying out ourselves and just being like out here on the road wounded and just like empty, but it's also something filling us back up. And we just have to be intentional about like filling that back up with God and filling that back up with his promises and different things that we should be thinking about, like Philippians 4:8. So I think vulnerability makes us more of ourselves. And you saying, vulnerability also allows God to like use us in a particular way. Wow. I think about David, and I think just about how like Psalms, it's like, I just feel like that's the book of vulnerability. How like David was like, okay, like this is my anxiety, these are my fears, these are the things that I know I messed up on, but God is still good. God, please forgive me. And I just think that if we didn't have Psalms, like there are other examples of like vulnerability in the Bible, but I really feel like Psalms is just like, you can come as yourself to God. Your vulnerability doesn't make God afraid. Your vulnerability doesn't overwhelm God in the way that we think it does. And I just think those are some of the ways that vulnerability is a blessing, just to kind of like counter like what happens when we aren't vulnerable. Like we keep all those things in, and it's like who can help us, you know?
Yeah, I think about man, you said so much right there. I think about vulnerability allowing you the opportunity to reconcile yourself with certain situations. When you are vulnerable, I think about when Jesus had to go to the cross and he went to the Garden of Gethsemane and he was vulnerable with God about what he was feeling. Please take this cup. And he reconciled. That's part of reconciling yourself with what it is you have to do. I remember when I was doing dialysis for a year and a half, and there were multiple points in there where I was breaking down and I was really struggling with the process. And I had to reconcile myself with whatever it was that God wanted me to learn from this, wanted me to do in this time, so that I could grow, so that I could be a better man of God, and even help people in a way, and shepherd people in a way that I'm not necessarily used to. So that's one part of it. I also feel like vulnerability can just make people grow closer. When Roxanne was talking about crying more, what do you say, this month? These past few weeks, like I can relate to that. Like I feel like this summer I've cried more than I've ever cried in my entire life, and I feel like partially it's because the people I'm around that I feel comfortable with, like I don't have to put on a face of like, oh, I'm this strong man. Like I've been wailing crying, like not even like no little like just crocodile tear or nothing. I'm talking like snotting crying. And so like even that, like that's a very freeing thing. But it also comes because I've been vulnerable with all those people I was sitting there crying in front of, and they've helped me through the different processes in my life. And that's amazing for a ministry. So I guess that goes right into our next question. So what does vulnerability add to our ministry? Oh my gosh, a level of closeness. A closeness that is needed. One thing that you don't want your ministry, a ministry of people walking around like they perfect. I feel like when people are vulnerable, I'm not saying you have to be vulnerable with everybody in your ministry, but when there's an atmosphere of vulnerability, or that is a standard, you allow the opportunity for grace. Because when you're vulnerable, people understand who they're dealing with, and they can extend grace in a different way. So like a lot of people, like she was talking about with the Stranger Things, people frustrated with them, but then they look into his life and see all the stuff he's gone through, and it's like, this makes sense. Not that we're excusing his actions, but we know how to encourage him better. We know how to be there for him in a better way. I think about ministry like that, when people understand who you are, allowing people the opportunity to understand who you are and where you come from. That creates the opportunity for you to even be able to show grace, which you should be able to show grace anyway, but it becomes easier. Like, I understand where this person is coming from. I know it's not malicious intent. I know they mean well, but this is like a part of who they are. And because of that, like, I think about, one of my, good friends that passed away, Kavi. Me and him, like, we had a rough relationship early on. But I think the more we dug in and learned each other more and more, it was easier for us to cultivate a relationship that was healthy and loving. And that became one of my really close friends. So vulnerability even does that. It allows you, and that's a beautiful thing about God, is that your relationship with God allows you to be friends with people you would have never been friends with before. But I think part of that is because of the level of vulnerability that you display.
And I think with vulnerability, I think it really allows ourselves to know, like, okay, so I know, like, when we all know, like, what we're weak in and what we're strong in, I think it makes us more powerful. I think when we're all operating on the fact that, like, okay, so, like, you can do this, like, you do that, but, like, do I know, like, what you're, like, struggling with? Like, do I know, like, how to support you in a specific way? I think when we, like, know the specific things, especially, like, thinking about a ministry, I think that we can just, like, be more, like, of a body and be more cohesive, because I feel like even, like, in our body, like, our body knows, like, our nose knows that our, like, our feet can't, like, like, do the same thing that the nose does, and our body knows that, like, our eyes don't have the same function as our legs. Like, thinking of different things like that, I think it just makes us, like, closer, and I think it makes us more intentional in how we can, like, support one another, how we can pray for one another, how we can even, like, offer our gifts and offer our strengths for those weaknesses, so that we can make sure that we're all growing together at a upgoing rate, like, at the same time. Like, it's not just like me just growing, but it's also like all of us growing at the same time, because we're all being vulnerable about the things that, like, help us. And it just reminds me of Moses. What if Moses never told God that he's not a good public speaker? Like, he would just, like, cancel all that. So no Exodus, no Numbers, no Deuteronomy, and just, like, okay.
We talking about somebody else.
Yeah. So I'd be like, we would have talked about somebody else. So, like, if Moses wasn't vulnerable in that one moment and, like, let God know that, like, what could have happened? Yeah. So I just think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I also think about vulnerability as a means, of course, to help people grow, but I also think about just when you create that atmosphere of vulnerability, you are putting yourself in a position to be challenged and accountable, and you want a culture of accountability. Sometimes it's easy to be very surface level at church, where it's like, oh, how you doing, God bless you and all that stuff, but like where you see something and this is something that's making that person struggle, where there's like, okay, I can't just let this, like, you feel more ownership for your ministry and the people in it. Like, I just can't let my brother fall by the wayside. I know he's struggling. I know what he's going through. I know this is something that he needs. So, like, I just can't sit here and watch, because I know. So, like, when somebody's weaknesses, like, you're not just gonna let them keep falling, or you shouldn't, at least. But I also think about the opportunities that come along with that. Like, I think when you're vulnerable, like, for example, one of my friends, Phil, he really wants to get into dance. He graduated college, and his passion is dance. This is what he wants to do with his life. And I'm at the gym today, and I see I'm getting a smoothie, and I'm talking to the guy who's at the register, and he's like, oh, he moved here from Arkansas. He has a dance company in Macon, and they're moving here within the next year. I'm like, will y'all be hiring once y'all move here, or y'all just bringing your own people? He's like, oh no, we'll be hiring. And I was like, but also like, do you mentor? You know, because even if like it's not just a full-time job, maybe Phil just needs to start his own dance company or anything like that. He's vulnerable about his feelings about that and his passion about that. Even being vulnerable about that, like this is something I really want to do, but this is also something that's discouraging because I can't find what I want in this field that I want to do in. It seems like it's almost impossible to get into this dream. He was open about those emotions. And then that makes me take it serious when I hear anybody, you know, you can sit there and say, oh, you know, I teach a class on two-stepping. You dance? Okay, bet. Let me connect you with my boy, Phil. I need some opportunities open up for him. And so I think vulnerability even opens doors for that.
Yeah, that's really good. That's all I have. I don't know about you.
I think that's all I have too.
Yeah. So thank you guys for listening. This was really put on both of our hearts just to share with y'all. I pray that you all found something useful in this, that it's going to be helpful for you or like someone that you know.
Yep. And once again, this is going to be called Real Talk. We're going to try to do this periodically. We hope that this is encouraging to the ministry. Like I said, this was, like Roxan said, this was something that was on our hearts and really inspired us. And we're like, you know what? People in our ministry need to start hearing from people in our ministry. And so we wanted to create this venue. We're going to have people on here with us in the future. So that, see what God's going to move within this process. So we thank you all for watching and listening, and God bless.